On Power. Its Nature and the History of its Growth. Bertrand de Jouvenel. 1949. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Book 3. Of the Nature of Power. Chapter 6. The Dialectic of Command. 1. Power in its pure state. 2. Reconstruction of the phenomenon by synthesis. 3. Command as cause. 4. Command as it first looked. 5. Command for its sake. 6. Pure power forswears itself. 7. Establishment of Monarchy. 8. From parasitism to symbiosis. 9. Formation of the nation in the person of the king. 10. The city of command. 11. Overthrow of power. 12. The two ways. 13. The natural evolution of every apparatus or rule. 14. The governmental ego. 15. The essential duality of power. 16. Of the egoism of power. 17. The noble forms of governmental egoism. The spectacle presented by modern society is that of an immense state apparatus, a veritable complex of moral and material controls by which individual actions are conditioned and around which private lives take shape. This apparatus grows with the growth of social needs, while its diseases infect both the life of society and the lives of individuals. The result is that, when we consider the sum of the services it renders us, the bare idea of its disappearance throws us into such a fright that an apparatus in such close communion with society naturally seems to us to have been made for it. Society, we see, has furnished it with the human elements which compose it, and its strength seems, therefore, only a centralized and mobilized fraction of society's strength. In a word, it is within society. If we look for the motive force which animates this power, we find at work on it a crowd of influences situated at different points of the social compass. These influences, being in unceasing strife and combination with one another, assume at times the form of great waves which force the ship of state onto a new course. It is a convenient substitute for the analysis of this diversity of influences to consolidate and integrate them into one will, and call it the general will or the will of society. And, since it is as its instrument that power functions, power must, one would think, have been forged by it. Such is power's dependence on the nation and so great its need to make its activities conform with the nation's necessities, that we are almost driven to the conclusion that the organs of command have been built up consciously, or unconsciously secreted, by society for use in its service. That is why jurists identify the state with the nation. The state, they say, is the nation personified, and organized as it needs to be for the government of itself and for dealing with others. There are great attractions in this view. Unfortunately, it leaves out of account a phenomenon which is met with only too frequently, the seizure of the state apparatus by a particular will which uses it to dominate and exploit society for egoistical ends. Once it is admitted that power may forswear its true reason and end, and as it were detach itself from society to form far above it a separate body for its oppression, then the whole theory of power's identity with society breaks down before this simple fact. 1. Power in its pure state. At this point nearly all who have written on the subject look the other way. A power which is both illegitimate and unjust is off their intellectual beat. This feeling of repugnance, while it is understandable, has to be overcome. For the phenomenon is of too frequent occurrence to give any chance of life to a theory which does not take account of it. It is clear enough how the mistake arose. It was from basing a science of power on observations made, as it is history's business to make them, of powers whose relations with society were of one kind only. What are in fact only its acquired characteristics were thus mistaken for power's essence. And so the knowledge acquired, while adequate to explain one state of things, was quite useless in dealing with the times of the great divorces between power and society. It is not true that power vanishes when it forswears its rightful begetter and acts in breach of the office which has been assigned to it. It continues as before to command and to be obeyed. Without that there is no power, with it no other attribute is needed for it to be. It is not, therefore, the case that its substance was ever fused with the nation. It had a life of its own. Neither did its essence he and its rightful reason and end. It can live, as it has shown, as command and nothing more. We must see it as if we are to grasp its inner reality, the thing without which it cannot be. That essence is command. I shall, therefore, take power in its pure state, command that lives for its sake and for its fruits, as the basic concept from which I shall set out to explain the characteristics developed by power in the course of its historical existence. Those characteristics have vastly changed its appearance. 2. Reconstruction of the phenomenon by synthesis. At the start of this undertaking it is necessary to clear away all misconception, whether it proceeds from the emotions or from the reason. No reasonable explanation of political phenomena in the concrete is possible if the reader, as in these days, alas, he is but too prone to do, runs away with one piece of the argument, either to justify with it his own emotional approach or to attack it in the name of that approach. Suppose, for example, that he extracts from the concept of pure power an apology for aggressive egoism as a principle of organization, then, in seeing even the germ of such an apology in this concept, he is guilty of wishful seeing. And the same is true if he reaches the conclusion that power, being evil in its root, is therefore basically evil in action, and supposes it to be the author's intention to show this. Let it be understood that our starting point is a clearly defined abstract concept, our object being to discover the complex reality by way of a logical approach conducted in successive stages. What is essential to our purpose is not that this basic concept should be true, but that it should be adequate, in the sense of being able to furnish a coherent explanation of every fact submitted to observation. That is the way of approach in all sciences. All stand in need of certain fundamental concepts, such as the line and the point, the mass and the energy. But we must not be expected, here is the second source of misconception, to copy the stern discipline of those exact sciences, to which, in that respect, political science will always be incomparably inferior. Even thought of apparently the most abstract kind is much dependent on the imagination, political thought is altogether governed by it. In politics the method of the geometrician would be but an artifice and a deception. We can make no affirmation about either power or society without having before our eyes apposite historical instances. Therefore, our attempt to reconstruct the course of power's transformation lays no claim to a dialectic which is independent of history or of the method of historical synthesis. Rather, we have tried to disentangle historical power's complex nature by considering the age-long interaction of causes which have been ideally simplified. Finally, let it be understood that we are concerned here only with power in large formations. Power in its pure state consists, as we have said, in command, a command which has an independent existence. This notion offends the widely disseminated feeling that command is but an effect of the humors of a group of men whose needs drive them into submission to rulers. This idea of a command effect breaks down. When choice has to be made between two hypotheses neither of which admits of proof, the sensible thing to do is to choose the simpler. It is easier to imagine one man or a few men having the will to command than all men having the will to obey, to conceive of one or a few with the love of domination than of all possessed by the inclination to obedience. Submission to a discipline is a product of the reason and is, therefore, of its nature later in time than the love of domination, which is instinctive. Submission is, politically, always a relatively passive factor. It may be doubted whether by itself it is creative at all, even whether the general need for and expectation of an authority can bring one into being. But that is not all. The idea that the rulers have been willed into ruling by the ruled is not only improbable. If regard is had to the larger formation, it is also contradictory and absurd. For it implies that a formation in which a command is set up had needs and feelings in common, was in fact a community. Whereas, as history shows, communities of any size owe their existence to one thing only, to the imposition of one and the same force, and one and the same command, on divergent groups. Power in its root principle is not and cannot be an emanation and an expression of the nation, because there was no such thing as nation until various separate elements had lived long together under the same power. Beyond all question, power came first. 3. Command as cause. This is the true relationship between them, but it has been obscured by the nationalist metaphysic prevalent in the 19th century. The historians of that time had had their imaginations so dazzled by striking instances of nationalist sentiment that they projected into the past, even into the distant past, the happenings of the present. They came to regard the sentimental groupings of their time as having an existence anterior to their own recent appearance. History becomes a novel about the personified nation, who, like a heroine of melodrama, always raised up at the critical moment the champion she needed. Rapacious conquerors, like Clovis or William of Normandy, became, by a quaint transformation, the servants of the will to be of the French or English nations. From one point of view history, like art, was greatly the gainer. At last it had found a unity of action, a continuity of movement and, above all, a central figure, all of which had been missing before. But it was literature, not history. The collective conscience is, it is true, a phenomenon of very great antiquity, but the narrow geographical limits of this conscience must not be forgotten. In no other way could those limits be put back but by the fusion of distinct societies. The work of fusion was the work of command. It is making a fateful mistake to suppose, as so many writers have supposed, that the major political formation, which is the state, was the natural product of human sociability. It seems a natural enough supposition, for society, which is a natural entity, is just such a product. But a natural society is a small thing. And for a small society to become a large one, a new factor is necessary. For that there must be fusion, and this in the great majority of cases comes, not from the instinct of association, but from that of domination. The large formation owes its existence to the instinct of domination. In early times the nation did not raise up leaders for itself for the good reason that, until leaders had already appeared, there was not, either in fact or in feeling, a nation. Let us have no nonsense, then, as to the compelling and coordinating energy which creates nations, being some ectoplasm or other risen from the depths of men in the mass. The history of large formations tells a different tale. Their first and original cause is just that energy, behind which we cannot go. As if to prove the case more completely still, the energy generally comes from outside the formation. 4. Command as it first looked. Conquest, and nothing but conquest, gives birth to large formations. Sometimes the conquerors are a component society within a group, but usually a warrior band from outside it. In the first case, one township takes command over many townships, in the other, one small people takes command over many peoples. Whatever the distinctions which the course of actual history forces us to draw, here can be no doubt that it is to these ancient phenomena that the notions of a capital city and a nobility owe in part their psychological content. The instruments chosen by fate to carry out this synthetic activity, as Auguste Comte calls it, are of the most ferocious. The modern states of Western Europe, for instance, have to allow as their founders those German tribes of which Tacitus, notwithstanding the prejudice of the over-civilized man in favor of the barbarian, has left us a terrifying picture. The Franks, from whom the French take their name, were no better than those Goths whose roving career of pillage and devastation has been described for us in the striking pages of Ammianus Marcellinus. The relative nearness to us in time of the Norman founders of the Kingdom of Sicily and of the companions in adventure of William the Bastard makes all doubt as to their real characters impossible. We have often seen them in the imagination, the greedy horde embarking at St. Valery-sur-Somme and then, arrived at London, having the country carved up among themselves by a victorious bandit chief, seated on his throne of stone. Strictly speaking, no doubt, they do not rank as unifiers of territories, but they came to supplant others who had done the work of unification for them and were very much like themselves. The Romans, those illustrious unifiers, were not in the beginning very different. On that score St. Augustine cherished no illusions. What are thieves' purchases but little kingdoms? For in thefts, the hands of the underlings are directed by the commander, the confederacy of them is sworn together, and the pillages shared by the law amongst them. And if those ragamuffins grow but up to be able enough to keep forts, build habitations, possess cities, and conquer adjoining nations, then their government is no more called thievish, but graced with the eminent name of a kingdom. 5. Command for its sake. It follows that the state is in essence the result of the successes achieved by a band of brigands who superimpose themselves on small, distinct societies. This band, which is itself organized in a society as fraternal and as full of thieves' justice as you please, behaves towards the vanquished and the subjected as power in the pure state. Power of this kind can make no claim to legitimacy. It pursues no just end, its one concern is the profitable exploitation of conquered and submissive subjects. It lives off the subject populations. The meaning of William's division of England into 60,000 knightly fiefs is just this, that henceforward 60,000 groups of men will each have to support by their labor one of the conquerors. There lies the justification, the only one visible to the eyes of the conquerors, for the continued existence of the subject populations at all. If they could not be made useful in this way, there would be no point in leaving them alive. And it is well worthy of note that, where the conquerors are more civilized and do not treat the conquered so, they will yet, without having intended it, end up by finally exterminating populations which are no use to them. Thus it has happened in both North America and Australia. The natives fared better beneath the rule of the Spaniards, who enslaved them. History, with whom there is no shuffling, shows no instance of a spontaneous relationship between the victor members of the state and the vanquished, other than that of exploitation. When the Turks had established themselves in Europe, they lived off the tribute paid them by the non-Mussulmans, whose difference of dress betrayed them as not belonging to the conquering race. It was a sort of annual ransom, the price extracted from those who could have been killed for being allowed to live. The Romans acted in the same way. They made war for its immediate gains of precious metals and slaves. The more treasure and the more ravaged victims that followed in the consul's train, the more applauded was his triumph. The essential feature of the relationship between the capital and the provinces was the gathering of tribute. The Romans regarded the conquest of Macedonia as marking the date from which it had become possible to live entirely off the taxes paid by the conquered provinces. Even Athens, democratic Athens herself, regarded the payment of taxation as unworthy of a citizen. Her coffers were filled by the tributes of her allies, and the more demagogic leaders increased their popularity by increasing the weight of these charges. Cleon raised them from 600 to 900 talents, Alcibiades to 1200. The parasitic domination of a small society over a collection of other societies, that is everywhere the mark of the big formation, the state. Whether the domestic economy of that small society is, as at Rome, republican, or, as at Athens, democratic, or, as at Sparta, egalitarian, in each the relations of the victors with the vanquished show us an exact picture of command for its sake and for its fruits. 6. Pure power forswears itself. What a hideously immoral phenomenon, you tell me. Wait a little. For here is an admirable case of time's revenge. The egoism of command leads to its own destruction. The further that the dominant society, urged on by its material appetites, extends the area of its domination, the more inadequate its strength becomes to hold down the growing mass of subjects, and to defend against other appetites and ever richer booty. That is why the Spartiates, who offer the perfect example of the exploiting society, limited their conquests. Again, the more the dominant society increases the weight of the charge which it imposes, the greater the desire it excites to shake off its yoke. Athens lost her empire by increasing the weight of the tributes which she extracted from it. It was for fear of that happening to them that the Spartiates took from the Helots a moderate rent only and allowed them to grow rich. The Spartiates knew how to discipline their egoism of domination. Among them, egoism acted as might's conductor to right, as it was put by a hearing. But domination, no matter how prudently administered in practice, had its term. In time the master gang thinned out. Its strength faded, so that in the end it could no longer hold out against foreign armies. Its only resource then was to inject strength into the subject mass. But it was too late. At the time that Augustus armed the dwellers round and changed their status, there were but 700 citizens left, and Sparta was in its dying agony. The instance of Sparta poses the problem which confronts power in its pure form. Founded as it is on force, it has to keep up this force by maintaining reasonable relations with the mass which it dominates. Those who dominate are compelled by the most elementary prudence to strengthen themselves with associates recruited from among the subject ranks. According as the dominant society takes the form of a city or a feudal state, Rome was the former, Norman England the latter, the active association takes the form either of extending the city's franchise to the new allies or of conferring knighthood on the serfs. In the case of the cities, a particularly strong repugnance is felt to this necessary process of reintegration of strength. This is shown by the opposition offered at Rome to the proposals for enfranchising the allies made by Livius Drusus, and by the ruinous war which the Republic had to endure before giving way. That is the way in which the relationship of domination established by conquest is kept up. The Roman Empire was the empire of Rome over its provinces, the kingdom of the Franks was the reign of the Franks in Gaul. In this way a political structure arises in which the superimposition of the society which commands upon those who obey is maintained. A relatively recent example of it is the Venetian Empire. 7. Establishment of Monarchy. So far we have treated the dominant society as if it were itself undifferentiated, but that, as the study of small societies shows us, is not the case. All the time that this dominant society is exercising over the subject societies a command which lives for its own sake and for its fruits, there is, in the interior of the dominant society itself, a command struggling to assert power over it. That command is the personal or royal power. Sometimes, as at Rome, it has fallen and vanished before the period of external conquests begins. Or sometimes, as in the case of the Germans, the king has still to be played at the time that external conquests start. Or finally, as in the case of the Macedonians, he has by that time already been played and the game won. If this royal power is in being, the collection of an empire gives it a wonderful chance, not only of consolidating its conquests, but of breaking, at the same time, the half-independent, half-equal status of its partners in them. What does it have to do? The king ceases to regard himself as the leader of a victorious band, the Rex Francorum, upon whose united aid he must rely to maintain a power of constraint. Instead he manipulates to his own advantage a part of the resources latent in the conquered formation, and employs them against either the rest of the formation or his own associates, whom he proceeds in this way to reduce to the level of subjects themselves. That, in its most brutal form, is what the Ottoman sultans did. From having been the chief man in a military feudal system, they became absolute monarchs when once they had made themselves independent of the involved Turkish chivalry. This they did by building up a new bodyguard, Yenisera, or Janissaries, from Christian children, who, owing them everything and loaded with privileges, proved an obedient instrument in their hands. For the same reason they chose their officers of state from Christians. Command remains in principle the same, it is still, as always, force. But now the force has left the hands of the conquerors as a whole, and has come to rest in those of the king as a man, who can now employ it even against his old companions in arms. The larger the part of these latent resources on which the king can lay his hands, the more authority will he have. He achieves much merely by attracting into his personal service some of the subjects, whom the contrast between the situation now within their grasp and the tyranny which so far they have endured will deeply affect. But he does better still if he can attach to his person the general body of the subjects by lightening such of the burdens laid on them as do not redound to his own advantage, the battle against the feudal system then opens. And in the end he crowns his efforts if he can manipulate to his own advantage the traditions of each of the groups which compose the whole. This Alexander did by giving himself out to be the son of Horus. Not everyone had the advantage of being taught by Aristotle, but what Alexander did was so natural that he has had many imitators since. Henry I, the Norman king of England, married a daughter of the old Saxon royal family. The son of their marriage he made the fulfillment of a prophecy. The last of the Anglo-Saxon kings, Edward the Confessor, had promised his people that, after a succession of usurpations, a child would reign who should mend all. Here was that child. 8. From parasitism to symbiosis. We see, systematically set out, the logical way of the establishment of what may be called national monarchy. It would still be an anachronism to use the word nation. Power, as is clear at once, has not changed a jot, it is still what it always was, a system of command for its own sake and for its fruits. The monarchy owes its existence to a twofold triumph, a military one, of conquerors over subjects, and a political one, of the king over the conquerors. The reason why one man can govern alone a vast mass of men is that he has forged the instruments which enable him to be, strangely enough, stronger than anyone else. Those instruments are the state apparatus. The subject mass is in the nature of a boon off which he lives and by means of which he maintains his state, sustains his instruments of compulsion, rewards loyalty, and pursues such ends as his ambitions suggest to him. But it would be no less true to say of this system of command that it owes its establishment to the protection which it has afforded the vanquished, its compulsive force to its skill in winning followers and making obedience popular, and, lastly, the resources which it draws from the people to the prosperity which it brings in its train. Both explanations exactly fit the case. Power took shape and root in habits and beliefs, but it developed its apparatus and multiplied its instruments through knowing how to turn the circumstances of the time to its advantage. But it could only so turn them by serving society. Its pursuit of its own authority never ceases, but the road to authority is through the services which it renders. No one supposes, when he sees a forester pruning a copse to help the trees to grow, or a gardener hunting for snails, tending young plants under glass frames, or exposing them to the health-giving heat of a conservatory, that these things are done from a feeling of affection for the vegetable kingdom. And yet care for it he does, much more so than cold reason would suppose. This affection, however, is not the motivating reason for his pains, it is rather their necessary accompaniment. Reason would ban all affection from these labors of his. But the nature of man is such that his affections are stirred by the pains he gives himself. And so it is with power. Command, which is its own end, comes in time to care for the common good. Those same tyrants who left behind them in the shape of the pyramids the proof of a horrifying egoism, also regulated the course of the Nile and fertilized the Felis fields. Western monarchs have the best of logical reasons for encouraging national industry, but the encouragement becomes in time a pleasure and a passion. What had been a one-way flow of services from the city of obedience to the city of command tends to be balanced by a countercurrent, even when the subjects are in no condition to claim benefits as of right. To speak in metaphor again, the plant of power when it has attained a certain growth cannot continue to draw nourishment from the subject soil without putting something back into it. Then comes its turn of giving. The monarch is not in the least the creature of his people, set up to satisfy their wants. He is rather a parasitic and dominating growth which has detached itself from the dominating group of parasitic conquerors. But the need to establish his authority, to maintain it and keep it supplied, binds him to a course of conduct which profits the vast majority of his subjects. To suppose that majority rule functions only in democracy is a fantastic illusion. The king, who is but one solitary individual, stands far more in need of the general support of society than any other form of government. And, since it is human nature for habit to engender affection, the king, though acting at first only from concern for authority, comes to act with affection as well and in the end to be motivated by affection. The mystical principle of the Rex has come again. Power has, by a wholly natural transition, moved from parasitism to symbiosis. The monarch is, as is obvious, at once the destroyer of the republic of conquerors and the builder of the nation. This explains the conflict of judgments which were passed on. For instance, the Roman emperors. They were condemned by the republicans at Rome and approved by the subject peoples of outlying provinces. And so, at the start of its career, power pulls down the exalted and exalts the humble. 9. Formation of the nation in the person of the king. The material conditions under which a nation lives are the product of conquest. It is conquest that builds an aggregate out of disparate elements. But the nation is not at first a whole, since each constituent group is conscious of its separate life. How can a common consciousness be formed? The sentiments of all must have a common point of attachment. Who is to be this center of crystallization for national sentiment? The answer is the monarch. By an unerring instinct he presents himself to each group as the substitute for and heir to its old chief. Take Philip II, we smile now at the almost interminable list of titles which he bore. We see in it only vanity. We are quite wrong, it was necessity. Being the master of several distinct peoples, he had to present to each an aspect which was familiar to each. Similarly, a king of France had to take the title of Duke in Brittany and of Dauphin in the Viennois. And the same thing held everywhere. The string of titles is but the counterpart of the various aspects he wears. In time, these aspects fuse, and spiritual divergences get resolved in the corporeal unity of the royal person. This process of fusion is of capital importance, for by it the throne becomes the place where emotional clashes are stayed and national sentiment formed. The thing in common between the Bretons and the people of the Viennois is that he who is duke of the one is dauphin of the other. In a sense, therefore, it is on the throne that the nation is based. Men become compatriots by reason of their allegiance to one and the same person. And now we see why it is that peoples formed in the monarchical mold inevitably regard the nation as a person. They think by analogy from the living person through whom a common sentiment has been formed. The Romans were without this conception. The idea of a supposititious being living outside and above them did not enter their imaginations. They conceived of nothing but the societas which they formed. And the subject peoples did not belong to this societas unless they were admitted to it. Herein lay the burning question of the franchise. The Romans did themselves no good by taking over the religious ceremonies of the vanquished and transporting them to Rome, for the subject peoples never came to have their spiritual home at Rome, or to regard it as their moral base. Never, that is to say, until the appearance of the emperors, who offered themselves to the adoration of each separate people in the image of what each wanted to adore. It was through the emperors that the aggregate became a whole. 10. The city of command. Let us now assemble everything that goes to the command of a large formation at different stages of its existence. In the early days of a state, the collection of people within it attains only at intervals to a unified existence. We see gathered in their assemblies the Gothic or Frankish conquerors, we see the Roman people sitting in conclave, we see the king presiding over his court of Norman barons. In them we see the lords of all, an elite in visible form superimposed upon the mass, a power existing for its own sake and for its fruits. Let us now jump forward in time. The place of assembly, be it field or forum or chamber, at times crowded and at times empty, has gone. There is now a palace, surrounded by a collection of buildings in which a variety of dignitaries and functionaries carry on their business. He who commands is now the king, helped by his permanent servants, his ministerials, his ministers. A whole new city has sprung up, the city of command, the place of dominion, the hearth of justice, the haven of the ambitious. Should we be right in saying that this city has a significance quite different from that of the old assembly of lords and masters? That the new tribe of dignitaries and functionaries are not masters at all, but servants? That they are servants of the king, whose will is in accord with the needs and desires of the people as a whole? That what we now see is, in short, a working apparatus placed in the hands of a social will? We should not be wrong, but we should not have said all. For the master's will, however closely it has been adapted to society, is still the master's will. And the apparatus is no passive instrument. It consists of men who have taken the place, by slow stages, of the old rulers, and they have succeeded to a position so similar to that of the old, that they have taken over some of their characteristics as well, so much so that in time they will leave the apparatus behind them, acquire wealth and nobility, and come to regard themselves as the posterity entitled to the conquering race. To this development Saint-Simon and Boulainvilliers are witnesses. We must not therefore cease to regard power, now that it is composed of the king and his administration, as a ruling elite. The difference is that it is now better equipped to rule, the more so that, besides ruling, it renders vast and indispensable services. 11. Overthrow of power. All these services, betokening as they do so admirable a solicitude for the mass of mankind, almost forbid the idea that, in its essence, power is still the dominating egoist that we at first postulated. Its behavior is quite changed, for now it dispenses the blessings of order, justice, security, prosperity. Its human content is quite different, for now it is made up of the most competent elements of the subject mass. This great transformation scene is entirely explicable by reference to the tendency of command to persist as such, which it can only do by drawing ever closer its ties with the people beneath it, by widening the scope of its services and the recruitment of its elite, and by a harmonization of wills. The effect is that power behaves for practical purposes as if it had exchanged its essential nature, which is egoist, for an acquired nature, which is social. But at the same time it gives proof of a tendency to oscillation. Sometimes this merges it completely with its asymptote, when it seems altogether social, and then again swings it back to its starting point, when it becomes egoist once more. It seems paradoxical, but the charge of domination now begins to be heard against a power which has become in intention profoundly social. This complaint can only take shape when power has finished its work of spiritual unification and the nation has become a conscious whole. The more keenly this unity is felt, the greater becomes the opposition to power as being not an emanation from the nation but something imposed on it. By a coincidence which is not at all unusual in social history, men become conscious of power's alien character just at the moment when it has become closely national. In the same way a working class will come to think itself oppressed at the very time when its burdens are being lightened. For a fact to bring to birth an idea, which is brought about by the thing observed being brought within the limits of conventional thought, its happening must have been near in time to the idea. The same condition holds true if a fact is to serve as a basis for an idea's being attacked for not being what it purports to be. So, then, this alien arbitrary, exploiting power, which exists for its sake and for its fruits, gets overthrown. Yet at the very moment of its overthrow it had ceased to be either alien, arbitrary or exploiting. Its human content had been entirely changed, its exactions were no more than what it required for its services, the maker of the nation had become its instrument, so far, that is to say, as it lay in power's nature to become it, so far as a transformation of command is possible without its ceasing to be. 12. The two ways. I make no claim to have traced here the historical evolution of power, but rather to have proved by a logical demonstration that the hypothesis of a power based on pure force and pure exploitation carries with it the implication that such a power must necessarily try to come to terms with its subjects and adjust itself to their needs and aspirations, that, although inspired by a pure egoism, and with no other end than itself, it will notwithstanding come, by a predestined road, to advance the interests of the community and to pursue social ends. In lasting it becomes social, it must become social to last. The problem then arises of how to eliminate what is left of its primitive nature, how to deprive it of all possibility of reverting to its original mode of conduct, how, in a word, to make its essence social. There are two possible ways. Of these, the one is logical but seems impracticable, the other seems easy but does not do the work required of it. It is, to start with, generally agreed that power which is balm of domination and lives to dominate ought to be destroyed. The next step is for us who know ourselves for compatriots and proclaim ourselves for fellow citizens to form a societas, for the joint management of our common interests. In this way we shall get ourselves a republic in which there is no longer a sovereign personage, whether in fleshly or ideal form, and one will no longer hold sway over the wills of all, where nothing can be got done except by an effective consensus of wills. We shall then have dispensed with any state apparatus formed in a centralized hierarchy and consisting of a coherent elite. We shall have gotten instead a large number of independent magistracies which the citizens will take it in turn to filter by going through phases of both command and obedience, whose alternation Aristotle made the essential feature of the republican form of government. That would indeed be the complete overthrow of the monarchical type of constitution. But tendencies of that kind, though in fact they show themselves, do not carry the day. What does carry the day is the simpler idea of preserving whole the monarchical state apparatus with one solitary difference, the substitution of the ideal personage, the nation, for the fleshly personage, the king. The city of command still stands. All that we have done has been to drive out the occupant of the palace and put in his place the representatives of the nation. The new arrivals will quickly find in their newly conquered habitation the memories, the traditions, the symbols, and the means of domination. 13. The natural evolution of every apparatus or rule. To give our investigation strictly logical form, we will, for argument's sake, suppose this legacy removed. We will suppose that the revolutionaries, while recognizing the necessity of having a coherent state apparatus, a city of command, want nothing of the old apparatus and of the old city. We will suppose them building a wholly new power, a power established by and for society, whose representative and servant it is by definition. This new power, too, I say, for all its origin, will in time elude the intentions of its creators and tend to an existence for its sake and for its fruits. Every association of men shows us the same spectacle. When once the social end ceases to be continuously pursued in common and becomes the permanent charge of one differentiated group, to be interfered with by the rest of the associates only at stated intervals, when once this differentiation has come about, then the responsible group becomes an elite, which acquires a life and interest of its own. It withstands on occasion the mass whence it came. And it carries the day. It is hard in reality for private persons attending a meeting, taken up as they are with their own concerns and without having concerted among themselves beforehand, to feel the confidence necessary to reject the proposals which are cleverly presented to them from the platform, and the necessity for which is supported by arguments based on considerations of a kind to which they are strangers. There, too, we see the reason why the Roman people was able for so long to pass its laws on the public square. An examination of the procedure followed shows conclusively that their effective part consisted merely in ratifying what had been jointly determined by the magistrates and the Senate. In our times the same methods are exactly reproduced at annual general meetings of shareholders. How could the managing class, strong in competence and brief to withstand opponents, fail to grow convinced that they are a people apart, that only in their hands can the interests of society be safeguarded and that, in brief, society's strongest interest is to preserve and cherish its elite of managers? 14. The governmental ego. If these phenomena occur, as they do, in every association, they cannot fail to press with peculiar intensity in political associations. There is no need to suppose that the persons chosen to govern are not in general perfectly representative men, exactly resembling their subjects. But when once they have been summoned to the exercise of sovereign authority, their wills take on, as is observed by Duguit, a new character and a different force. Those who act in the name of the sovereign authority and express a sovereign will are set above the rest and act in regard to them by way of command, and by no other way. Those whom the sovereign addresses are bound to execute the order which he gives them, not because of what is in the order but because it comes to them from a will which is naturally superior to their own. It is then the case that the exercise of the sovereign authority engenders a feeling of superiority which in effect turns these likes of the ordinary citizen into his unlikes. But yet, you say to me, they act only as his agents and trustees. You think so? From his experiences as a deputy in the 1848 Assembly, Proudhon drew this lesson. It is no use saying that the elected person or the representative of the people is only the trustee for the people, its delegate, its advocate, its agent, its interpreter, and so forth, notwithstanding this sovereignty which belongs, in theory, to the mass, and the formal and legal subordination to it of its agent, representative or interpreter. It will never come about that the agent's influence and authority will not be greater than his principles and that he takes trusteeship seriously. It will always be so, in despite of principle, the delegate of the sovereign will be the master of the sovereign. Sovereignty on which a man cannot enter, if I may so put it, is as empty a right as property on which he cannot enter. Standing thus above the mass, to which the difference in their positions has made them different psychologically, the managers are drawn together among themselves, all being under the influence of their situations and functions. All those, said Spencer, who make up the organization of government and administration, join up together and draw apart from the rest. They form an elite, as has been emphasized by Rousseau, who noted both the social inevitability and the moral consequences of its happening. That the governing elite may come into being and have a life of its own which distinguishes it from the rest of the state, that all its members may act in unison and answer the end which it exists to pursue, for this it must have its private ego, an esprit de corps shared by its members, and a force and will of its own which make for its preservation. 15. The essential duality of power. The point could not be better put, that society, in setting up an apparatus for its service, has brought to birth a small society which differs from itself and has, inevitably, its own sentiments, interests, and personal wills. Anyone wishing to regard the nation as a moral being, endowed with a collective conscience, and capable of exercising a general will, must see in power what Rousseau saw, another being, with its conscience and its will, drawn on by natural egoism to the pursuit of its private advantage. Striking evidence can be produced as to this egoism. It is true, remarked Lavassa, the historian, that the public authority in France, under whatever regime, the Republican as well as the rest, has its own, narrow, egoistical ends. It is, I will not say a coterie, but a consortium of people who, having attained authority originally by an accident, are thenceforward concerned not to lose it by an accident. National sovereignty is undoubtedly a lie. As to the sentiments animating the consortium, we have the testimony of the great Bolingbroke. I am afraid that we came to court in the same dispositions that all parties have done, that the principal spring of our actions was to have the government of the state in our own hands, that our principal views were the conservation of this power, great employments to ourselves, and great opportunities of rewarding those who had helped to raise us, and of hurting those who stood in opposition to us. Candor of this kind is rare among those who command. But it expresses accurately the view taken by those who obey. Forewarned by their intuitions and educated by their experience, the people regard as turncoats those who leave them to enter the city of command. In a son of a peasant turned tax-gatherer, in a trade union secretary turned minister, his old associates detect one who has suddenly become a stranger to them. The reason is in effect that there is a climate of authority which changes men. The inmates of power are, in consequence, as much and as necessarily the guardians of its house as are opium takers of their den. The subjects, feeling that government is not being conducted exclusively for their benefit, charge the regime, be it monarchy or republic, with a vice which belongs to human nature. There is, inescapably, egoism in power. We posited at the beginning a power whose essence was egoist. We saw it acquire a social nature. We have now reached the position of positing a power whose essence is social and seeing it acquire an egoist nature. This convergence of rational sequences brings us to the irrational conclusion of the whole matter. In the makeup of power in the real, two natures are necessarily found in association. In whatever way and in whatever spirit it has been established, power is neither angel nor brute, but, like man himself, a composite creature, uniting in itself two contradictory natures. 16. Of the egoism of power. It would be absurd to claim to have identified in every historical power a combination, whether in the same or in different proportions, of two chemically pure substances, egoism and in the social sense. Every nascent science, and political science is, heaven knows, immature enough, has to make use of abstract ideas. But it should not be lost sight of that these ideas are in fact so many syntheses of pictures supplied us by the memory. These pictures will always color the ideas, creating associations which will only be shaken off, and then imperfectly, by long habit. Therefore, great care is needed in the handling of abstract ideas, which must be kept imprecise so as not to exclude the admission of further pictures. I go so far as to say that they should remain undefined until an adequate inventory has been taken of the actual things perceived to which they should provide the common denominator. If, for instance, we base our idea of power's egoism on the picture supplied us by the king of the Bantus, for whom ruling is, in essence, nothing more than swimming in wealth and eating enormous meals, so that the same word, fuma, serves to denote both ruling and eating, if, under the influence of this picture of an obese chieftain swollen with fat, we start looking for his exact equivalent in the modern world, we shall not find it. In these days the exercise of power does not take the form of a preoccupation with overeating, and the ministers who abuse their offices to enjoy and enrich themselves are the exceptions. Is that to say that a careful scrutiny will disclose nothing in common between the Bantus' way of doing things and our own? They heap up tribute in the form of food, we pile on taxes. The king eats his revenues, but he is joined in this by his dependents and those who help him in governing, the equivalent of our administrative corps and our police forces. So that there is a group of tribute eaters with a vested interest in the enlargement of the tributes, a group into which the governed, who pay the imposition, here again the same word, luha, denotes governed and taxpayers, strive to break, so as to exchange the position of nourisher for that of nourished. Would anyone be so bold as to assert that nothing of the same kind happens in our society? But there is more to it than this. The king employs a considerable part of the tribute in grants of largesse, bestowed by way of banquets or presents, to those whose support consolidates his authority, whereas their defection would endanger it. Do we not see modern governments as well using the public funds to endow social groups or classes, whose votes they are anxious to secure? Today the name is different, and it is called the redistribution of incomes by taxation. It would beyond question be wrong to say that power levies taxation today firstly for the benefit of its own machine and then to gain supporters by boons or beneficia. But all the same, does not this egoist interpretation of taxation come as a necessary corrective to the social conception of it which is usually taught? Is it quite true to say that the pace at which taxes grow does no more than keep faithfully in step with the growth of social needs? That the only reason for multiplication of posts is extension of services, and that services are never extended to excuse the multiplication of posts? Is it absolutely certain that the motive for largesse to the public is always the care for social justice and never the interest of the governing faction? The picture of the public official, of a man completely disinterested and wedded to the public interest, who is indeed one of the least materially minded human types to be found in our society, rises at this point to reproach us for these suggestions, yet what confirmation of them there is every time that power changes hands and is used by the victorious party after the Bantu fashion, as a banquet at which the new arrivals fight for places and throw the scraps to their supporters. Let us take note, without at this place developing the point, that the egoist principle comes to life again in its most barbarous shape every time that power changes hands, even when the professed object of the change has been the triumph of the social principle. And let us reach this provisional conclusion, that it would be as incorrect to form an exclusively egoist picture of power as to form an exclusively social one. A stereoscopic view combining these two pictures presents a truth which is very different. 17. The noble forms of governmental egoism. We must not form too narrow and squalid a conception of governmental egoism, a term which only denotes the tendency to live for itself which we have seen to be an inherent feature of power. But this tendency shows itself in more ways than in the utilization of power for the advantage of those exercising it. The pleasures which the holding of it brings are, except to spirits of an irretrievable squalor, quite different from that of gorged cupidity. Man, in love with himself and made for action, rises in his own esteem with every extension of his personality and multiplication of his faculties. The leader of any group of men whatsoever feels thereby an almost physical enlargement of himself. His nature changes with his stature. The personal prudence and avarice which we associate with egoism are rarely seen in him. His restricted gestures take on an amplitude. He has, as the ordinary man truly puts it, lordly virtues and vices. He is the man of destiny. Command is a mountaintop. The air breathed there is different, and the perspective seen there are different, from those of the valley of obedience. The passion for order and the genius of construction, which are part of man's natural endowment, get full play there. The man who has grown great sees from the top of his tower what he can make, if he so wills, of the swarming masses below him. Are the ends which he sets before himself for the weal of society? Possibly. Are they in conformity with its desires? Often. And so the leader easily convinces himself that his one ambition is to serve the whole, and forgets that his real motive spring is the enjoyment of action and expansion. I have no doubt that Napoleon was sincere when he said to Caulaincourt, "People are wrong in thinking me ambitious. I am touched by the misfortunes of peoples. I want them to be happy and, if I live 10 years, the French will be happy." This memorable assertion well illustrates the claim invariably made by command, which makes itself its end, that its one and only aim in life is to serve social objectives. The he is not, it is true, always as flagrant, nor the contradiction always as glaring. And how often it happens that the turn of events gives some plausibility to the lie, for social ends are achieved, and it is of no interest to history whether they were the real motive spring of the men of power. The egoism of power and its social sense leave us, you say, in inextricable confusion. We are lost in a maze. Not at all. We have reached the goal. We stand in the presence of power as it is, as all history has fashioned it. From now on they will strike us as futile and puerile, these endlessly renewed claims to be creating a power from which all trace of egoism will be purged away. The mind of man, in love with a simplicity which it finds nowhere in nature, cannot be convinced that the duality of power is of its essence. Ever since the divine dreamings of Plato, themselves stemming from earlier utopias, the search has gone on for an entirely virtuous government and one which lives only for the interests and the wishes of the governed. For thinkers this illusion has done no more than thwart the creation of a political science worthy of the name, but, reaching the multitude, the disposer of power, it has become the fruitful cause of the great disturbances which desolate our age and threaten the very existence of civilization. The vices and abuses seen in the power that is in being are not actively restrained by the citizens, as knowing that such vices and abuses are inherent in the nature of power. Civically passive, but emotionally active, they take these vices and abuses for the stigmata of a bad power which should be overturned to make place for another power which shall be infinitely just and beneficent. Away, then, with the egoisms, which, by long practice, have come to adapt themselves to society and have learned that, to attain their own satisfaction, they must first satisfy the needs of the generality by putting to the service of the public good the whole force of their private passions. The road is now clear, the fool has said, for a spirit which is altogether social, a spirit with which the aspirants to power claim to be overflowing. Even if they spoke truth, it is still unproven that the abstract and ideal conception of the general good which they bring with them would be any improvement on the practical and empirical understanding of the body of society which was possessed by their old established predecessors. And, even if they should become completely stripped of egoism, even then something, as we shall see, would be lacking to power. But, in sober truth, pretensions of this kind are always unjustified. Disinterested feelings may stir some of the conquerors of power, but with them are mingled, both in the conquerors themselves and in their following, ambitions and appetites. Every change of regime and, to a lesser extent, every change of government is, as it were, a reproduction, on a more or less reduced scale, of a barbarian invasion. The newcomers wander about the powerhouse with feelings in which curiosity, pride, greed, all have a place. The credit which they then for the first time enjoy enables them to make full use of this formidable machinery, and even to add to it some further controls of their own. In time yet another faction will, by promising to make a better use of it, force its way and turn into the city of command, which it will find already embellished by its forerunners. So that the hope, always renewed, of stripping from power all trace of egoism results only in forging ever vaster means of compulsion for the next egoism. Therefore, that is not political science which does not recognize the essential duality of power. The egoist principle cannot be purged out of it. We have seen the natural ways in which it adapts itself to the social interest. Also, no doubt, there are artificial ways, but they form part of the art of politics, and that is another story. We may rest content with having made some advance in knowledge of power in the concrete. Chapter 7. The Expansionist Character of Power. 1. Egoism is a necessary part of power. 2. From egoism to idealism. 3. The egoistical stimulus of growth. 4. The social justifications for power's growth. 5. Power as the repository of human hopes. 6. Thought and power, the philosopher and the tyrant. If there is in power's makeup an egoistical urge combined with the will to serve society, it is a natural supposition that, the weaker the former, the stronger will be the latter. Perfection of government would consist in the complete elimination of the egoistical principle. The chimera of elimination has been unceasingly pursued by minds whose limited range is only equaled by their good intentions. They do not realize that the nature of man and the nature of society combine to make any such project chimerical. For without the egoistical principle, power would lack the inner strength which alone enables it to carry out its functions. The duality is irreducible. And it is through the interplay of these two antithetical principles that the tendency of power is towards occupying an ever larger place in society. The various conjunctures of events beckon it on at the same time that its appetite is driving it to fresh pastures. Thus there ensues a growth of power to which there is no limit, a growth which is fostered by more and more altruistic externals, though the motive spring is still as always the wish to dominate. 1. Egoism is a necessary part of power. It is, no doubt, a flattering picture, this of a managing elite motivated exclusively by benevolence. The rulers themselves are so susceptible to it that they profess to dislike the discharge of public duties, which they claim to have undertaken from nothing but a sense of duty. But so much devotion, even if it was genuine, would not be to society's advantage. Any advantage there was would come to it only from minds of a purely speculative type, whose presence in public life has often been desiderated. A government of that kind fails, apart from one other very serious disadvantage to which we shall revert, from a lack of red blood, of which the governed quickly become conscious. In the order of nature everything dies which is not sustained by an intense and brutal love of self. Power, in the same way, can only maintain the ascendancy necessary to it by the intense and brutal love which the rulers have for their authority. It has, alas, to be agreed that tenderness of heart, going to the length of self-denial, spells self-inflicted death to power. Instances of this are the case of Lamartine and the ever-memorable one of Louis XVI. In an illuminating passage Tocqueville has shown us the monarchy turning into its own prosecutor for its crimes, and calling down on itself a wrath from which it has no wish to protect itself. It lacked the will to live. Go and tell the Swiss not to fire. History rejects the heroes proffered it by poetry, the generous Carlos, the tender Alexius, the debonair Charles Edward. They were dear to their contemporaries, and even today's sensitive spirits shed a tear for them. But, as Luther said, God has not given rulers a fox's tail but a saber. In other words, a certain feeling of superiority, a certain taste for domination, a certain assurance of tightness, and an imperious temper are appropriate qualities in rulers. The Roi Divito, the good little king of Béranger's song, was like no king that ever kept his throne. Our era, too, has experimented in debonair rulers. Notwithstanding their amiable qualities, or perhaps because of them, history has swept them away with her broom. The life of Frederick the Great is in this respect an object lesson. The amiable young man that he was. But had he so remained, he would have gone the way of the Tsarevich Alexius. Then he mounted the throne, and an astonished Europe saw a very different person. A truce, then, to seeking in rulers virtues which are foreign to their condition. Power takes life from those who exercise it, it is warmed and nourished unceasingly by means of the enjoyments which it procures them. The keenest of these enjoyments are not those infantile delights of luxury and vanity which dazzle the popular imagination, irritate the small shopkeeper and thereby demonstrate to him the egoism of power. The banquets portrayed for us by the Burgundian chroniclers, the state processions, the luxury which encompassed a Charles the Bold, a Julian II, a Lorenzo de' Medici, a Francis I, or a Louis XIV, those epicures of wealth, that is what annoys the public. Yet we may feel grateful for their prodigalities, to which we owe the Van Eycks and Michelangelos of this world, as well as the Sistine Chapel in Versailles. The wasteful habits of princes have proved the most precious treasure of humanity. To be completely acquitted of egoism by the generality, rulers need only affect a studied austerity and a strict economy. As if the real pleasures of authority were not quite other. In every condition of life and social position, a man feels himself more of a man when he is imposing himself and making others the instruments of his will, the means to the great ends of which he has an intoxicating vision. To rule a people, what an extension of the ego is there! The ephemeral delight given us when, after a long illness, our limbs return to their duty can alone give us some small idea of that incomparable pleasure of radiating daily impulsions into an immense mass and prompting the distant movements of millions of unknown limbs. It can be savored in the shadows of a cabinet by a gray-haired and black-coated official. The thoughts he thinks keep pace with the orders he gives. He sees in his mind's eye the canal being dug along the line which his pencil has traced on the map, the boats which will shortly give it life, the villages springing up on its banks, the profusion of merchandise heaped high on the quays of his dream town. It is not surprising that Colbert, on coming to his desk in the morning, rubbed his hands for joy as the tale is told by Perrault. This intoxicating pleasure of moving the pieces on the board of the social game breaks out continually in Napoleon's correspondence. Is it merely attention to detail that makes him, even in time of peace, prescribe the route that each troop of soldiers is to take across his vast empire, determine the number of muskets to be stored in each armory, how many cannon balls there shall be in each place, or how much cotton shall be imported into France and through what customs houses, the way which it shall follow and the time which it shall take to come from Salonica? Far from it, when he regulates the vast traffic of men and goods, he feels, as it were, the coursing of an infusion of new blood which supplements his own. In this way the people ruled becomes in some sort an extension of the ruler's ego. His sensations of pleasure in them are at first positive and then reflex, that is to say, the pleasure is no longer simply that of moving so many pieces, but has become a deeply felt consciousness of whatever affects any one of them. At that point the egoism of power extends to the whole people, and its identification with them is complete. It was, in olden days, the monarchic principle which had to double the parts of a directing egoism and of an identification of itself with the social mass. And in this way the institution of monarchy, so far from merely subsuming the interests of the mass into those of one man, became sensitive to every wound received by every little cell. A secure hold on power and its descent in a regular line assured the maximum of identification of egoism with the general advantage. Whereas, contrariwise, a transient or precarious hold on power tends to make of the nation merely the instrument of a personal destiny, of an egoism which resists absorption in the whole. The more quickly the holders of power succeed each other, the less completely can their egoism be extended to a body which is but their mount of a day. Their ego stands more apart and takes its enjoyments in more vulgar fashion. Or else, if their egoism can be projected outwards at all, it stops at a formation, such as a party, with which it can stay in long association. So that the nation gets ruled by a succession of men who have identified their egos not with it but with parties in it. It is the public service which is the repository of that sublimated sort of egoism which is the preservative of power. Permanent officials bring to the maintenance and enlargement of their offices, which in their innermost hearts they regard always as a piece of their property, and which they have often inherited, the diligence of a lifetime. The social virtue of monarchy, which consists in identifying the ego with society, finds a pallid reflex in hereditary officialdom, or in the great seminaries, which secure by other means the same continuity of sentiments. 2. From egoism to idealism. Once the necessity of there being a power in society is admitted, it has to be agreed that it needs a preservative. This it gets from the affection felt by the rulers for their own functions, which in time they confound with their own personalities. By means of these functions they project what each feels himself to the far extremities of the body social. This concrete invisible phenomenon has given birth, by unconscious processes of thought, to the widespread theory of the nation person, of which the state is the visible expression. The only element of truth in it is psychological. For those who are identified with the state, the nation is in effect the expression of their persons. We must beware of the consequences which follow if we push this train of thought to its logical conclusion. If the governmental ego really could spread itself out over the mass of its subjects in such a way as not only to control all their activities but also to receive back from them every impress it bears, the traditional political antinomies would be finally resolved. To inquire whether the impulsive force should come down from power in the shape of authoritative commands, or should ascend to it from the body social in expressions of the general will, would be a vain question, seeing that these commands would, ex hypothesi, have been fully adapted to that will. The only problem left would be the philosophical one of which came first. Starting from the egoistical nature of power, we should reach the conclusion that this egoism, even if given full rein, could desire for the future only what the needs of society demanded. This theory, absurd as it is, would be hardly more so than that which was for years the staple food of political economy. For if, left to themselves, the egoisms of individuals are bound to produce the best of all possible worlds, why should not the same apply to the egoisms of governments? Political science needs purging of sophistries of this kind, all of them due to the same mistake of giving an indefinite extension to a truth which is valid only within certain limits. Reason and observation alike permit the conclusion that the lengths to which the egoism of men of high place carries them in their self-identification with society are all the greater if their hold of power is stable and of long date. The notion of legitimacy is an expression of this truth. Legitimate power is one in which power's interests and those of society have reached an accommodation through getting used to each other. But neither logic nor experience permits us to say that instinctive feeling can ever operate so as to make this accommodation complete. Here is the sunken reef on which have foundered all those doctrines both of ancient and modern times which taught that complete egoism could be the foundation for complete altruism. If it is true, what has never been strictly proven, that a man's maximum good results from thinking only of the good of others, it is a matter of observation that in practice he is incapable of inducing his egoism to the distant point at which these fruitful consequences begin. In the case of even the most legitimate rulers, egoism continues to occupy a halfway house. It still gives out antisocial manifestations in sufficient quantities to render, should they be emphasized, the egoistical instinct suspect to the public, and make them unmindful of the services to society which, incontestably, egoism provides. The altruism for which the public calls is not a subconscious byproduct but a conscious principle of government. But as soon as power is conceived as being exclusively the agent of the common good, it must form a clear picture for itself of what this common good is. While power was egoist, the vital necessity under which it lay of reaching every day a daily accommodation with society, itself sufficed to form in it pictures of public requirements which, though confused, were born of actual contacts. But as soon as power, under the spur of altruism, has a vision of the entire community and what medicine it needs, the inadequacy of the human intelligence to such a task appears in its fullness. What the judgment pronounces then shows itself a blinder guide than what the senses indicate. To put it another way, touch is superior to vision. It is a noteworthy fact that all the greatest political mistakes stem from defective appraisals of the common good, mistakes from which egoism, had it been called into consultation, would have warned power off. Take, for example, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Louis XIV was far too well aware of the value of the eminent services rendered to his authority by the clever mechanics who were his subjects. The admission of talented persons into France had been pursued as a policy by the monarchy for too long and with results which were too fruitful, for the king not to have taken into account the enormous disadvantages to himself of a step which would have the effect of throwing the best French citizens into the arms of the Dutch enemies and the English rivals of France. If, notwithstanding this, he took so disastrous a decision, it was through the impulsion of a false conception of the common good and of his duty as ruler. In his funeral oration Massillon expressly says so, "You specious reasons of policy, in vain you presented to Louis the timid counsels of human wisdom, the body of the monarchy enfeebled by the emigration of so many citizens, the course of commerce retarded either by the loss of their labor or the secret removal of their wealth, neighboring nations becoming the protectors of heresy and ready to fly to arms in its defense. Dangers but strengthened his zeal. If it is yet possible to stand sufficiently away from the all-engulfing catastrophe of our own time, so as to pass a historical judgment on it, it seems to furnish an analogous instance. A healthy egoism would, in the absence of other motives, have dissuaded an ambitious power from racial persecutions which were bound, as it knew, to excite universal indignation, and which, as it admitted itself, helped to throw into the scale of its enemies the immense weight of a nation which disposed of unlimited resources. Have we not here, too, a case in which an arbitrary vision of what society ought to be has hurled the power seeing it into the crudest blunders from which the instinct of self-preservation would have saved it? It is not true to say that power redeems its egoism by pursuing ends which it considers social, for society is a complex structure, and, when it comes to ways of improving it, bogus science and ideological passion are blind and cruel guides, and not a whit less cruel for the people itself being privy to the errors committed. Power, egoist though it is, can render immense services to society. It can also do untold harm in its attempts to render them. But only by intellectual analysis can we distinguish in it the two strands which the course of its actual life makes inextricable. The egoism which gives it life and the ideal which it claims to be realizing are inseparable features of it. As the personalities of the great giants of power show, they can no longer tell whether it is themselves or their peoples that inebriate them, they take everything and believe that they are giving it. In the successive stages of power's existence, the joint action of these two characteristics serves to inflate it, the one gives it cash, the other tenacity. 3. The egoistical stimulus of growth. To the extent that command is a species of egoism, it tends naturally to grow. Man, says Rousseau, is a limited creature. His life is short, his pleasures no bounds, his capacity for enjoyment is always static, and it is no good his raising himself in his own imagination, for he continues to be small. The state, on the contrary, being an artificial body, knows no fixed bounds, the greatness which belongs to it is unlimited, and can always be increased by itself. And the egoisms which shape it and give it life expand its conquests. The spirit of conquest has had both its shocked accusers and its apologists. The latter praise it for its work of consolidation and reconsolidation of small political entities, a work which has resulted in the creation of vast formations which are, to their minds, the necessary condition of a more perfect division of labor, of more efficient social cooperation and, in short, of an advance of civilization. The outward growth of power has excited much comment, the inward growth astonishingly little. Insufficient attention has been given to the fact that any power whatsoever looks on the mass it rules as an investment from which it can draw the resources needed by it for its purposes, or as a block of stone to be fashioned as it sees fit. To resume the likening of a nation to an individual, but without forgetting that it is really only the rulers who so look at it, the head aims continually at pressing more services from the body, and the brain in increasing its conscious control of the limbs. This characteristic of power shows itself in concrete ways, in the increased budgets of which it disposes, and in the spawning of regulations which it imposes and of officials who see to their execution. Limiting ourselves to outward signs, have we ever seen a power which, unlike the others, was not impelled by an inner urge to grow? That is not to say that every power has been equally successful, or that the steady growth of expenditure, of legislation, and of officialdom is due to nothing but the impulse of power. My point is that this impulse is immanent in every power whatsoever. The impulse is nourished by all the egoisms, great or small, noble or sordid, which, taken together, make up the egoism of power. The perspectives which open before the great man are invisible to Tom and Dick as they come and go on their daily tasks. From them he must draw, whether by permission or constraint matters not, the means he has need of. The ruler of poor quality dreams no such exalted dreams, but he lets all the nuts in the machine go loose, and from their slackening will come the uncontested need for new levies and a further supply of public servants. At the bottom of the governmental ladder, the official, silently and imperceptibly, breeds the official, and brings his cousins and dependents into the offices of state. The history of the West, from the time of Europe's fragmentation into sovereign states, shows us an almost uninterrupted advance in the growth of governmental power. The only way of failing to see it is to fix exclusive attention on the forms which power takes. A picture of pure fantasy is then formed, in which monarchs appear as masters to whose exactions there are no bounds, to be succeeded by representative governments whose resources are proportionate to their authority, until in the end democracy succeeds and receives from a consenting people only what it chooses to give to a power which is its servant. These are imponderables. But there are also ponderables, the dimensions of armies, the weight of taxation, the number of officials. The measurable scale of these implements provides an exact index of the growth of power. Begin at the reign of Philip Augustus. Without taxation to maintain him, the king lives, like other landlords, off his own estate. Without an army at his command, he keeps a meager bodyguard who feed at his own table. Without officials, he depends for the discharge of public business on ecclesiastics whom he employs and on servants whom he appoints. Even his public treasure, as well as his private fortune, has an ecclesiastical home and is left in the hands of the monks who act as his bankers. Though I am his subject, my path never crosses that of this head squire. He demands no tax from me, claims from me no military service, and passes no law which can possibly affect my life. By the end of the reign of Louis XIV, what a change is here for my countrymen. After a struggle lasting for centuries, the people has been brought to fill the royal coffers at regular intervals. The monarch maintains out of his revenues a standing army of 200,000 men. His intendants make him obeyed in every province, and his police harry the malcontents. He gives out laws and sets his dragoons at those who do not worship God in what he considers the right way. An enormous army of officials animates and directs the nation. Power has imposed its will. It is now no longer one small dot in society but a great stain at the center of it, a network of lines which run right through it. An infliction, you say? Is not the revolution which overthrows the king going to pull down his structure, attack his apparatus of command, which it will partly at any rate destroy, and reduce the taxation paid by the people? By no means. Instead it will introduce the conscription which the monarchy long desired but never had the strength to realize. True it is that Colonna's budgets will never be seen again, but the reason simply is that they will be doubled under Napoleon and trebled under the Restoration. The intendant will have gone, but the prefect will have taken his place. And so the distension grows. From one regime to another, always more soldiers, more taxes, more laws, more officials. I am not saying that the impulsion of power is the only operative cause of all this. I do say that none can read history without being continuously conscious of its presence. Sometimes the impulsion relaxes, as when Charles V, on his deathbed, renounced all the taxes which he had with so much trouble imposed and maintained, and which had made possible the victories of his reign. Almost at once, however, they were reimposed, though the doing of it required much bloodshed. Pauses there are, even retreats, but these are but incidents in the progress through the centuries of power's distension. It is true, no doubt, that power could not make this progress but for the very real services which it renders and under cover of the hopes aroused by its displays of the altruistic side of its nature. 4. The social justifications for power's growth. When power makes a demand for resources for itself, it quickly wears down the complacence of the subjects. A 13th century king might crave a grant for dressing his eldest son, amid seemly rejoicings, in knight's armor. But if too soon after he bethought him of giving his daughter in marriage and asked the provision of a suitable dowry, he would meet with a very bad reception. To raise contributions, power must invoke the public interest. It was in this way that the 100 Years' War, by multiplying the occasions on which the monarchy was forced to request the cooperation of the people, accustomed them in the end, after a long succession of occasional levies, to a permanent tax, an outcome which outlived the reasons for it. It was in this way, too, that the Revolutionary Wars provided the justification for conscription, even though the files of 1789 disclosed a unanimous hostility to its feeble beginnings under the monarchy. Conscription achieved fixation. And so it is that times of danger, when power takes action for the general safety, are worth much to it in accretions to its armory, and these, when the crisis has passed, it keeps. It has, moreover, long been a matter of observation that the egoism of power profits by public insecurity. War, exclaimed Omer Talon, is a monster whom there is a conspiracy not to throttle, so that it may continue always as the opportunity of those who abuse the royal authority, enabling them to devour such property as is still left in private hands. It is impossible to exaggerate the part played by war in the distension of power, but war is not the only set of circumstances in which it can invoke the public interest to strengthen its grip on the nation. Its role is not merely that of defender of its subjects against other powers which are like unto itself, it claims also to protect them against forces which are different in kind. The mistake of not seeing in society more than the one power, i.e. the governmental or public authority, has an astonishingly wide vogue. Whereas in fact the governmental is but one of the authorities present in society, there exist alongside it a whole host of others, which are at once its collaborators, in that they help it in securing social order, and its rivals, in that, like it, they claim men's obedience and inveigle them into their service. These non-governmental authorities, to which we give the name social authorities, are no more blessed with an angelic nature than is power itself. If they all were so blessed, there could be, depend on it, nothing but perfect harmony and cooperation between them. But it is not so, however altruistic one of these authorities, such as the paternal or the ecclesiastical, is intended by nature to be, human nature imparts to it a measure of egoism, it tends to make itself its end. Whereas, conversely, an authority which is by nature egoist, such as the employers or the feudal lords, is sobered by time, and develops by unequal stages the spirit of protection and kindness. Every authority is, by the law of its nature, essentially dualist. Being ambitious, each separate authority tends to grow, being egoistical, to consult only its own immediate interest, being jealous, to pare down the role of the other authorities. There thus ensues an incessant strife of authorities. And this strife provides the state with its main chance. The growth of its authority strikes private individuals as being not so much a continual encroachment on their liberty as an attempt to put down the various petty tyrannies to which they have been subjected. It looks as though the advance of the state is a means to the advance of the individual. Here is the main reason for the endless complicity of subjects in the designs of power. It is the true secret of power's expansion. 5. Power as the repository of human hopes. Mankind passionately desires to escape the dooms of his destiny and his condition, and this wish of his is, when transformed into action, the origin of all progress. But it is also the basis of that vulgar form of prayer which asks the intervention of the invisible powers in our private affairs. Is it not natural that prayers of this kind, directed as they are to practical ends, should be addressed also to a visible authority, which is no less powerful to destroy the author of our oppression or of the wrong done us, no less rich for the ample fulfillment of all our wishes, and no less sovereign for the transformation of our entire lives? The scepter is, as it were, a magic wand which can work miracles for us, see la roi voulait. But these miracles can only come about in so far as power is not kept within the leading strings of a strict rule of law. If it lacks the ability to temper justice with expediency and to grant boons unexpectedly, its fairy enchantments quickly fade. Hence it is that institutions of moderate tempo become, in Lamartine's vigorous phrase, a bore. Though the hurtfulness of arbitrary power be proved and reproved 1,000 times, arbitrary power will always start up anew. To shake it off, men must grow tired of paying too dearly for a chance, which is too small, of the arbitrary ruler playing their game, just as we weary of a lottery in which we have gone on losing over a long time. But arbitrary power is forever lifting its head again, it returns to life by means of its promises, the irresistible attraction of which paves its way for it. The wider the gap between man's awakened desires and the realities of his existence, the more clamorous are the passions which summon and fetch him the magician. Nor is power the repository only of egoistical hopes, it is that of altruistic or, more accurately, socialist hopes as well. That is a miserable philosophy which explains all human behavior by the simple motive of egoistical interest. It is given the lie both by the unceasing formation in speculative brains of visions of a better order and by the influence of these visions on men who have nothing personally to gain by the change. Any account of the various social transformations which neglected the determining influence of these visions would be an entirely false one. Yet, they too, no less than the grossest, most muddled expectations, are grist to power's mill. In the realm of nature there is nothing able to satisfy the human spirit's primitive passions. In love with his own experiments, with the simple relationships and direct causations his brain can grasp, and with the artless plans which he is wise enough to construct, man wishes that the whole created world may show itself built not only with the same instruments as he possesses but also by the same turns of skill as he has mastered. Rejoicing as he does in all that can be brought to uniformity, he is forever being disconcerted by the infinite variety which nature herself seems to prefer, as instanced by the chemical structure of organic bodies. It is an agreeable game, imagining how man, if he had the power, would reconstruct the universe, the simple and uniform lines on which he would do it. He has not that power, but he has, or thinks he has, the power of reconstructing the social order. This is a sphere in which he reckons that the laws of nature do not run for him, and there he tries to plant the simplicity which is his ruling passion and which he mistakes for perfection. So soon as an intellectual imagines a simple order of things, he is serving the growth of power. For the existing order, here as everywhere, is complex and rests on a whole mass of supports, authorities, sentiments, and adjustments of the most varied kind. If it is sought to make one spring do the work of so many, how strong must be the force of its recoil, or if one pillar must support henceforward what many supported, it must be of the stoutest. Only power can be that spring or that pillar, and what a power it must be. Simply because speculative thought tends to neglect the usefulness of a crowd of secondary factors which make for order, it leads inevitably to the reinforcement of the central authority, and never more surely than when it is unsettling every kind of authority, the central included, for authority there must be, and when it rises again it is, inevitably, in the most concentrated form open to it. 6. Thought and power, the philosopher and the tyrant. Much misapprehension exists as to the true relations between thought and power. Thought has only to be the habitual critic of the existing order and established authority for her passion for order and authority as such to be completely overlooked. Rich in ideas of the beautiful, the harmonious, and the just, thought is bruised and revolted by all social reality. Here, it says, are cities spread out at random giving equal offense both to the eye and to the nostril, within them is a swarm of ugly, stupid, and unhappy beings, here stupidity darkens counsel, and stingy greed and squalid evil make holiday, are they to be found here? The royal homes of nature's king who has been made the reflex of the divine intelligence? How, from the depths of this sewer, can thought fail to evoke an ideal city, in which the severe beauty of the citizens would match the majestical quality of the buildings? It was in the slums of Naples that Campanella, The Dominican had his dream of a city of the sun, which should carry on its walls no lascivious scrawlings, but geometrical figures and pictures of the animals and plants catalogued by science and of the instruments created by human ingenuity, its life to be presided over by the supreme metaphysician. Campanella, Tommaso, 1568–1639, a Dominican monk, who was kept in prison at Naples for 27 years by the Spanish authorities for supposed complicity in a political conspiracy. His Civitas Soils, the work here referred to, was written in prison and produced in 1623. It is a cold and abstract variant of More's Utopia, with the same Platonic background. In this way, under the stimulus of the divine tenderness which feels both loathing and love, which transforms and raises what it loves, the speculative man builds his perfect society, his republic, his utopia, whence all disorder and injustice have been banished. Take a look, however, at the way in which the master builders of paradises, the Platos, the Mores, the Campanellas, set about it. They get rid of the clashes by getting rid of the differences. Let the citizens never know, said Plato, and let them never desire to learn what it is to act independently and not in concert, and let them never form the habit of so acting, rather, let them all advance in step towards the same objects and let them have always and in everything but one common way of life. Property is held in common, the magistrates will give to each citizen his share of what he needs. Clothing is uniform, meals are taken in common, lodging is in common, and Campanella shows us the magistrates distributing the inhabitants, for periods of 6 months, among the various dormitories, and having the name of each put up over each bed. The magistrates assign to each his task, and their consent, revocable at any time, is necessary to any course of studies. More divides up the lives of his utopians between work in the fields and professional work in the cities, the latter, unless the magistrates decide otherwise, to be for each man what his father did before him. No one might leave his house without a permit specifying the date of his return. And Plato was for prohibiting all foreign travel, except on account of the public service. He imposed on the citizens on their return the duty of expounding to the rising generation how vastly inferior to their own were the institutions of other lands. Such are the rules of the ideal republic dreamed of by the philosophers, the vision of which could bring enchantment to our ancestors at a time when they were obvious fantasies and in no danger of being realized. We in our time, as the storm clouds draw nearer, look more closely at them. We look for liberty there and do not find it. These dreams are, one and all, of tyrannies, of straighter, heavier, more oppressive tyrannies than any that history has yet shown us. In all of them, order is secured at the price of universal registration and wholesale regimentation. That is where thought leads us with no bit and bridle. And the imaginings are most revealing as to its natural bent. Thought delights in order, because thought is intelligence, and it conceives of order as simple, because thought is human. Whenever it strives to realize order, it displays the somber savagery of a Savonarola or a Calvin. More often, however, it seeks and summons to its aid the man of action, its temporal arm. We see Plato, for instance, expecting his laws to be enforced by the tyrant of Syracuse. Is that a paradox, the association of the philosopher with the tyrant? By no means. Authority can never be too despotic for the speculative man, so long as he deludes himself that its arbitrary force will further his plans. Proof of this is the attraction, seen time after time, which Russian despotism has had for the intellectuals. The approach of Auguste Comte to Tsar Nicholas is but a repetition of Diderot's waiting for Catherine the Great to promulgate by UK's the encyclopedist dogmas. Disillusioned with the weapon proper to itself, persuasion, the intelligence admires those instruments of power which are swifter in action, and Voltaire found it in him to admire Catherine's ability to make 50,000 men march into Poland to establish their toleration and liberty of conscience. And so the credulous tribe of philosophers works in power's behalf, vaunting its merits right up to the point at which power disillusions it, whereupon, it is true, it breaks into cursings, but still it serves the cause of power in general, by placing its hopes in a radical and systematic application of its principles, being a thing which only a capacious power can achieve. Benjamin Constant mocked with good reason at the unphilosophical preference of the learned for authoritarian methods. Every great development of the unlawful use of force, every recourse to illegal measures in times of crisis, has been, from one century to another, related with respect and described with complacence. The author, sitting peacefully at his desk, looses off arbitrary power in all directions and tries to make his style reflect the dashing quality which he approves in measures. He sees himself, just for a moment, dressed in authority by reason of his praising its abuses. He warms his speculative life at the fire of all the demonstrations of force and power which serve to decorate his periods. In this way he finds a sort of pleasure in authority. He repeats at the top of his voice the fine phrases, safety of the people, supreme law, public interest, he is lost in admiration of his own profundity and stands amazed at his own energy. Poor fool! His words are addressed to men who ask nothing better than to hear them, and who, having heard, will take the first opportunity of trying his theory out on him. Thought, dreaming of an order which is at once too simple and too rigid, seeking to realize it too quickly by measures which are too drastic and too radical, is in a perpetual conspiracy on power's behalf. Even in giving battle to the actual incumbents of authority, it is still working for authority's enlargement. For it puts into society's head visions which cannot take concrete shape but by an immense effort in the opposite direction to that of the natural course of things, an effort of which only power, and a big one at that, is capable. So that in some thought furnishes power with quite the most effective justification for its growth. As a self-proclaimed egoist, power encounters the resistance of all the particular social interests with which it must have dealings. But let it call itself altruistic and give itself out for the execution of an ideal, and it will acquire such an ascendancy over every concrete interest as will enable it to sacrifice them to the fulfillment of its mission and crush every obstruction to its triumphal march. Chapter 8. Of Political Rivalry. 1. Is war alien to modern times? 2. A self-militarizing civilization. 3. The law of political rivalry. 4. Advance of power, advance of war. Advance of war, advance of power. 5. From the feudal army to the royal army. 6. War, midwife of absolute monarchy. 7. Powers in international rivalry. 8. Conscription. 9. The era of cannon fodder. 10. Total war. History is the register of the strife of authorities. Always and everywhere man takes possession of man to bend him to his will and adapt him to his designs, so that society is seen to be a galaxy of authorities which arise, grow, and fight each other. Between authorities which are different in kind, as is political authority from that of either the family or the squire or the priest, collaboration and conflict go on simultaneously. Between authorities which are similar in kind and unlimited in their scope, the natural state of things is war. In the eyes of a man who lives exclusively in his own time, which may by happy chance have been a peaceful one, war seems but an accident. But to him who contemplates the unfolding of the ages, war presents itself as an activity of states which pertains to their essence. The picture evoked by these shifting colors is that of the crawling of amoebas observed under the microscope. That, heaven help us, is history. 1. Is war alien to modern times? Before the 19th century, this sort of cannibalism was the principal subject matter of historical studies. From that time on, our learned men have looked elsewhere. They thought, not without reason, that in modern times the spirit of conquest pertains, never to peoples, but only to their rulers, and they were rash enough to assume that the course of political evolution was that of the subordination of rulers to their peoples. War, therefore, was a thing of the past. The themes of the present were quite other, of man throwing off the yoke of social despotisms and, with the help of science, skill, and combination, making himself master of the earth's resources. Bringing this modern eye to bear on the centuries that had passed, it seemed to man as if the wars which had given luster to monarchs and left as their legacy to students the names of innumerable battles were but so many adventitious happenings which had cut across the main and essential lines of human development. The real history was much more truly this development than the tale of military escapades. For the development gave a picture of a continuous advance in one direction, the integrated exploitation of the world's resources for the benefit of man in association with his fellows. This was the end to which the peoples of the world, now the masters of their fate and the clear-eyed graduates of education, would march henceforward in conscious unison. Each separate power, being now the servant of its nation, would press on this advance. If by any chance there were any further clash of arms, it could but be as by a deplorable collision between the cars driven by the various states. The fault was that of inexpert drivers or, but this would be quite exceptional, of crazy and morbid ambitions. But is the will to aggrandizement nothing more than an aberration of rulers? If it is so, how is it that the rulers most covetous of territory have also been the most astute to organize their peoples? Of such were Peter the Great, Frederick II, Napoleon, Bismarck, perhaps we must add the name of Stalin. Can it be doubted that the genius of statesmanship proves itself both in expansion and in administration, and that power administers to conquer and conquers to administer? The instinct of growth is proper to power, it is a part of its essence and does not change with its changing forms. For power is still command, with the passions proper to command, of which the first is to expand the area which is beneath its rule. Maybe this passion will lie dormant for decades, but its awakening is in the order of things. For like attracts like, authority attracts the authoritarian, and empire the imperious. The quality of conquest is as much an attribute of power as is infection of the bacillus, both have their periods of torpor, from which they awake to renewed vigor. After an interval of calm, the modern tyrannies were to find to their hands such resources as had been beyond the hopes of their ancient models, just as the sleeper in Wells' Tale found when he awoke that, while he was asleep, his wealth had marvelously multiplied. At the very time when, as it was claimed, violence had been banished from history, it was making its presence felt as much as ever. But this was happening in distant parts, where savage or technically backward peoples were being incorporated cheaply. The splashes of color denoting the various states hardly changed in Europe but spread out overseas, and were soon confronting each other on fresh continents, multiplying in the process their frontiers, their disputes, and in the end their battlefields. The wealth amassed by private persons was building up for the state immense resources for war. Metallurgical factories were going up which could, when the time came, be used for the construction of enormous guns. Savings were pouring into the banks which would defray the expenses of the war. Why was Germany developing production in the Brie Basin, and England smiling at the grip of her great companies on the world's oil fields, and Russia covering herself with a network of railways? These activities all looked peaceful enough, but were in reality a process of accumulating trump cards to play in the unceasing game of power. Lastly, the democratic advance itself put arms in the armories of governments. Powers which are seen by all to be strangers to the peoples they rule cannot sweep them along into making really great sacrifices, where, on the other hand, they are intimately linked to their peoples, they can get more out of them, as was shown by the astonishing amount of force put at the disposal of successive authorities by revolutionary and imperial France, the reason being that she conceived these authorities to be bone of her bone. The upshot is that those very phenomena which seemed to give promise of an era of perpetual peace were in fact building up for the various powers material and psychological munitions of war, such as far surpassed in intensity and scale anything seen before. 2. A self-militarizing civilization. Was it not conformable, you say, with the laws of history that a great society, such as is the Western world of our day, forming in itself a slice of civilization, should become demilitarized as its development proceeded? Had not this phenomenon been seen to happen in the Roman world? The longer this civilization lasted, the less inclined did its members become to take up arms. The military calling, which had been in early days the natural vocation of every adult man, as among all the primitive peoples, such as the Iroquois, the Zulus, the Abyssinians, it is seen to be, became in the end a specialized and discredited profession. This process of progressive demilitarization showed itself in the number of Roman effectives available. The still uncouth city which Hannibal came over to attack numbered a mere 1,000,000 men at the time that it put in the field against him a Canian army of more than 85,000 men. But when its armies clashed at Pharsalia, the Republic, though by then it was spread out over the whole of the Mediterranean basin, could not put in the field more than 65,000 men in all. When Tiberius strained every nerve to avenge the legions of Varus, he could send the future Germanicus but 50,000 men. Marcus Aurelius seems to have had not many more in his attempt to finish off the secular quarrel with the Parthians. When Julian checked the Alemanni near Strasbourg, he had 13,000 men, and Belisarius was given 11,000 by Justinian to win back Italy from the Goths. Such is the natural evolution of a people which is rising in the scale of civilization. It is also the explanation of the people's culminating impotence in the face of the invasions of the Goths and Vandals, who were but small nations in arms, numbering but a few tens of thousands of men. The smallest province in the empire, had its inhabitants still been trained to arms, could have wiped them out. Assuredly, Alaric could have no more taken the Rome of old than Genseric the Carthage of old. The path followed by our own civilization is in the opposite direction. It is leading it to a catastrophe just as total but of quite a different kind. At Poitiers, which was the decisive battle of the 14th century, about 50,000 men were engaged, and about the same number fought at Marignan. Only very few more, some 65,000 it is said, fought at Nördlingen, the decisive battle of the 30 Years' War. But come to Malplaquet in 1709 and Leipzig in 1813, the figures there are 200,000 and 450,000 respectively. In our time we have improved on that. The 1914 war killed or mutilated 5 times as many men as were under arms in Europe at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And in this present war, 19,391,945, there is no counting the people involved. We are ending up where the savages began. 3. The Law of Political Rivalry. Why is it that we are retreating from civilization instead of advancing towards it like the Romans? One difference between their world and ours leaps to the mind: theirs was monist, ours is pluralist. In its human content ours is perhaps less diversified than the Roman, but it is split up among several governments, each one of which, as Rousseau says, feels itself weak as long as there are stronger ones than itself. Its safety and preservation demand that it make itself stronger than its neighbors. Rousseau continues. As its size is purely relative, the body politic must institute comparisons to get to know itself. It is dependent on what is around it and it must take an interest in everything that goes on there. It would be useless for it to try to stay as it is and keep within its own shell. It becomes weak or strong according as its neighbor expands or contracts, grows stronger or weaker. This natural jealousy between powers has brought to birth one rule which is familiar enough: states pay dearly if they forget it even momentarily, that every annexation of territory by one power, by increasing its sources of supply, compels each of the others to look about for a like extension with a view to redressing the balance. There is, however, another way of growing stronger which is much more to be feared than any acquisition of territory, that is the advance made by any one power in exploiting the natural resources of its own national domain. If it increases the draft which it makes on the strength and wealth of its people and contrives to get this increase accepted, it then changes the relationship between its own sinews of war and those of its neighbors. It becomes, if its capital is small, the equal of great powers, and if it is large it brings hegemony within its reach. If in the time of Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden's place in the world of politics was out of all proportion to the country's importance, the reason was that this great king had made the activities of the nation subservient to his designs, to an extent never before seen. Prussia, too, in the time of Frederick II, could not have kept at bay a coalition of three great monarchies, each one of which could have obliterated her, but for the similar intensive exploitation of her capabilities. And, to conclude, France at the time of the Revolution gained in a single bound frontiers which Louis XIV had been unable to reach, for the reason that the more total power then in control had drawn more deeply on the national resources. Burke, writing in 1795, understood this well. The state, France, is all in all. Everything is referred to the production of force. It is military in its principle, in its maxims, in its spirit and in all its movements. Were France but half of what it is in population, in compactness, in applicability of its force, it would be too strong for most of the states of Europe, constituted as they are, and proceeding as they proceed. Every encroachment by power on society, whether it has been made with a view to war or for some totally different purpose, gives that power an advantage in war. Evidence of this is supplied by the two German invasions of France, made within a quarter of a century of each other. The debacle of 1940, which took the place of the miracle of the Marne in 1914, was probably the result less of the enfeeblement of France than of the accretion of German strength brought about by total mobilization of her energies. Further evidence of it is supplied by the very different destinies awaiting the Russian armies in the two wars, a difference which was due entirely to the conquests wrought in the interval by the power inside that vast domain. The lesson is that no state can remain indifferent to another state's wresting from its people more of their rights. It must make a corresponding draft on its own people's rights, or else pay dearly for its neglect to put itself on a level. So France had already lost the War of 1870 because, through failure to impose military conscription as her neighbor had done, she could only put in the field against the Prussians' armies which were much inferior in numbers. The most pressing and best known aspect of the phenomenon is the race in armaments. But the race in armaments is but the shadow and the reflex of a much more serious development, the race in totalitarianisms. A power which interferes with its people only in certain respects cannot increase its warlike potential beyond certain limits. To pass them, it must revolutionize those respects and give itself fresh prerogatives. 4. Advance of power, advance of war. Advance of war, advance of power. Thus it happens that the great steps forward in the process of militarization are linked up, whether as effect or cause, with the great steps forward of power. Sometimes the reason is that a political revolution suddenly strengthens power and so makes possible a scale of armaments which was previously impossible. That happened when Cromwell built up without difficulty a naval power for England which was beyond the dreams of Charles I, or when the French Revolution instituted conscription, a thing which the servants of the monarchy would not have dared propose. Sometimes the need to attain military equality with a formidable rival can be invoked to justify an advance of power, as in France in Charles VII's time, or in the United States today. We see, then, that, as every advance of power is useful for war, so war is useful for the advance of power. War is like a sheepdog harrying the laggard powers to catch up their smarter fellows in the totalitarian race. This intimate tie between war and power is a constant feature of European history. Each state which has in its turn exercised political hegemony got itself the wherewithal by subjugating its people more completely than its rivals could subjugate theirs. And to resist absorption by their predecessors in hegemony, the other powers of the continent were bound to get on a level with them. If a feudal monarchy succeeded in getting financial aids from its vassals at more and more frequent intervals and could thus increase the number of mercenaries in its employ, the others had to copy it. If in the end these aids were consolidated into a permanent tax for maintaining a standing army, still the movement had to be followed, for, as Adam Smith remarks, once the system of having a standing army had been adopted by one civilized nation, all its neighbors had to introduce it. Security reasons made it inevitable, for the old militias were quite incapable of resisting an army of that kind. But once the monarchy could rest on a standing army, it was in the way to impose taxation arbitrarily, in other words, to make itself absolute. And from that time it must also battle its way towards military conscription, of the menace of which Montesquieu was already conscious. Military conscription, towards which the monarchies were making more or less timid advances, was inaugurated by revolutionary France. And to it she owed her victories, most of which were won by overwhelming superiority of numbers. Right up to 1809, the French armies retained this superiority in all their battles. Gneisenau formulated the only possible answer: the revolution has deployed in its entirety the national strength of the French people. The other European states must draw on the same reserves with a view to restoring the ancient balance of Europe. Such being the way in which political rivalry works, attempts at the limitation of armaments are, it is clear, a vain thing. Armaments are merely an expression of power. They grow because power grows. And yet those parties are loudest in demanding their limitation which, with unperceived inconsequence, are the most ardent supporters of power's expansion. Power is linked with war, and a society wishing to limit war's ravages can find no other way than by limiting the scope of power. 5. From the feudal army to the royal army. The social regime which imposes the narrowest limits on the extent of a nation's involvement in war is the aristocratic regime, the reason being that no other regime is equally allergic to the expansion of power. Such a regime wears, it is true, an essentially militarist air because the business of the ruling class is war. But then, war is the business of no other class. At Sparta, for instance, the disproportionately small number of soldiers compared to the population as a whole is striking, and in Western Europe the establishment of feudalism was the signal for a drastic cut in the size of armies. The number of Charlemagne's effectives is not reached again until the 17th century. The need to hold in check the Saracen or Hungarian cavalry, and to take up new positions as speedily as the Norman pirates and their light craft, led to the introduction of the cavalry era, but only the cavalry of the feudal lords, of which the king could not rightly call more than one troop his own. At that time the people took no part at all in war, were unaffected by it, except for those over whose plots of land it passed, and the memory of those days is preserved in the cry often uttered by the people today: those who want war have only to make it themselves and leave us alone. There are big differences between the army of a landed aristocracy, which is naturally incoherent and undisciplined by reason of the diversity of the contingents forming it, and that of an urban aristocracy, to which, contrariwise, community of interests and education and the intimate ties of custom lend a peculiar strength. Troops of the latter type are superior to mercenaries, whereas troops of the former are bound to go down before paid regular troops, as was seen at Cressy and Nicopolis. The ordas, or companies, of Janissaries were the expression of a power which was much more extreme than any of its contemporaries in the West, who were to prove unable, right up to the end of the 17th century, to offer effective resistance to it. The English army, a paid army, from the Prince of Wales down to the lowest archer, was the expression of a monarchy which could already get from its vassals and commons regular subsidies, and was soon to get its hands on the national output of wool so as to provide itself with foreign exchange. Lastly, it could harness to its service the largest capitalists of the period, those of Florence. In the history of France, the 100 Years' War represents the attempts of the royal power to get on an equal basis with the enemy power. Numbered among them are the requests for subsidies made by Philip VI and John II to successive assemblies which were sometimes general and sometimes regional. So too are the taxes imposed for the ransom of John II, taxes which Charles V continued to levy and to which his victories were due. The taxes suppressed, the English fortunes revived again. The significant thing that came out of the 100 Years' War was the institution of the permanent poll tax, tie, wherewith to maintain the orderly companies, that is to say a standing and paid force of cavalry, 1,444. In this way the result of the first great conflict of arms in Western society was to strengthen power. 6. War, midwife of absolute monarchy. And all the wars in all the centuries in which European states fight each other will have the same results. In the 16th century and for a part of the 17th, Spain was the leading power in Europe, buttressed with the gold of the New World and, above all, with the army forged for her by Gonzalo of Cordova, the great captain. The Ordinance of 1496 instituted even at that early date a kind of conscription. 1 out of 12 of all subjects between the ages of 20 and 45 were bidden to the service of the state. Those bidden became soldiers. That was the origin of that redoubtable Spanish infantry, in time to be celebrated by Bossuet. The development of absolute monarchy in both England and France is linked with the efforts of their respective dynasties to resist the dangers from Spain. James I owed his wide powers to the Armada. Richelieu and Mazarin could raise high the prerogatives of the state because they could invoke unceasingly the peril from abroad. Fontenay-Marolles gives us some idea of how large a part was played by military exigencies in liquidating the ancient forms of government and paving the way for absolute monarchy. To save the realm, it was absolutely necessary that the king should have in it an authority which was sufficiently absolute to enable him to do whatever should seem good to him. For since he was dealing with the King of Spain with his large country in which he takes what he wants, it is only too certain that had our king had to assemble the States General, as is generally done, or to depend on the benevolence of the Parliament for getting all that he needed, it would never have been got. Richelieu, finding that the entire military effectives of France had been reduced to 10,000 men by Marie de Medici, raised them to 60,000. Then, after having kept up for many years the war in Germany by means of subsidies to the Swedes and others, putting, as he reported to the king, his hand in the purse rather than on the sword, when the exhaustion of the Swedes and their defeat at Nördlingen obliged him to step in, he did so with 100,000 foot soldiers and 20,000 cavalrymen, armies on a scale unknown to France for 8 centuries. Heavy taxation was needed to sustain this effort. Its collection could not be delayed by regard to forms, nor made subject to the consent of the taxed. Oblivion overtook the lesson taught by Comines. What king or nobleman is there on earth who has power to lay on his subjects a penny piece of taxation without the grant and consent of those who have to pay, except by tyranny and violence? Tyranny of this kind was justified in France by the unceasing purpose to stay the progress of Spain. 7. Powers in international rivalry. But while Richelieu, with an eye on victory in the political battle, was violating all rights and destroying all institutions which obstructed the state's power to tax, he was causing his rivals, all of them anxious to maintain their own positions, to take similar measures. Olivares in Spain strove to make effective the maxim that the good of the nation and the army transcends every law and every privilege. In England, Charles I lost patience with Parliament's refusal and levied ship money illegally, thereby calling out Hampton's resistance. Hampton's trial took place near the end of 1637. In 1639, Normandy revolted against Richelieu in an attempt to stop the levying of all taxes imposed since the death of Henry IV. In 1640, revolution broke out in Catalonia for the preservation of the traditional privileges and liberties. The Fronde, in its relation to European events, is but one of many reactions to the onward march in step of all the competing powers towards domestic absolutism. The Fronde did not succeed in undoing the work of Richelieu, by which was formed, according to de Retz, in the most legitimate of monarchies, the most scandalous and dangerous tyranny that has ever existed. As a result, the power of Louis XIV came to dominate Europe. Whereupon the other European states naturally started to invoke in their turn the need to check the course of France's advance. The envy felt for Louis XIV by other princes is at the root of their usurpations of authority over their peoples. But the menace of his hegemony gave them a perfectly honorable pretext for imitating him. 8. Conscription. Achievement of the right to search its subjects' pockets for the wherewithal to maintain its enterprises had been the first great victory of power in modern times. At first, in the time of the English parliaments, the States General of France, and the Cortes of Spain, taxation had been dependent upon the consent of the taxed. Then it became arbitrary, a step which marked an immense advance of power. But another, and for the waging of war still more important, advance had still to be achieved, to lay hands on the very bodies of power's subjects, to swell the armies. Nothing was more alien than this to the genius of aristocratic societies. It is natural to them to be defended only by the aristocrats. That is the interest, the office, and the privilege of aristocracy. It is as warriors that they make themselves, taken as a whole, indispensable to the monarch who is their chief and to the common people who depend on them. As champions of the one and protectors of the other, they gain both the good opinion of the nation and the respect due to their position, and they are no less able to defend national interests against the foreigner than their own interest against encroachment from above and agitation from below. The employment of mercenary troops had already cut into this monopoly of the profession of arms. It perished when military service ceased to be the preserve of the nobility and was extended to the entire population. As we shall see, kings have always yearned for universal military service. It provided them, so far as internal order was concerned, with the means of throwing down the barrier to state encroachments presented by the aristocratic order. And in respect of external order, it brought them a prodigious accretion of resources. The only way in which Gustavus Adolphus had been able to maintain his armies in Germany had been by securing that in every commune of Sweden the inhabitants periodically selected some of their number for the king's service. Louvois made a proposal to keep up to strength in the same way the French regiments whose wastage could not be made good by voluntary recruiting. It was, as he explained at the start, only for the purpose of local defense that 35 regiments, aptly called territorial, were being formed. But his initiative encountered so much opposition that he had to substitute for the selection of recruits a drawing by lot for them. What peasant distrust had felt coming soon came. These regiments acted as depots which could be drawn on to make good the numbers in regiments on active service. Such were the timid beginnings of the militarization of entire peoples. It was in Prussia that the new system first spread its wings. A kingdom of recent formation, it possessed neither population nor wealth on any scale, nor had it any territorial cohesion. Its various provinces had varying histories and lacked unity. Frederick William made it his aim to maintain an army which should be composed of the finest soldiers that could be recruited throughout the length and breadth of Germany and Europe. To each of his regiments he allotted a portion or canton of Prussian soil. Each canton furnished its regiment with the recruits needed to fill its ranks. These conscripts, who went by the name of cantonists, served in the first instance only for a few months, but they were recalled for a few weeks every year and joined up in time of war. Such was the import of the famous rescript of 1733. Military service, the status of reservist, mobilization in time of war, all were the work of Prussia. The small resources of men and money possessed by Prussia in its early days caused an ambitious power to mobilize the strength of the nation to a point hitherto unknown. And Prussia, though it was still small by the side of France, notwithstanding the consecutive accretions brought it by its glorious victories, had under arms on the eve of the Revolution 195,000 men, as against 180,000 in France. It was a great advantage of the Prussian system that these 195,000 men cost only some 45 millions, which was less than half the cost of the less numerous French army. These figures, 180,000 French soldiers, 195,000 Prussians, 240,000 Austrians, sufficiently explain France's passivity towards the close of the monarchy, which remained deaf to the appeals reaching it from Holland in 1787 and Belgium in 1789, thereby missing its chance of closing once for all that open door to the enemies of France, its northeast frontier. The audacity which succeeded to this pusillanimity made ample amends. Harebrained and politically inexperienced rulers plunged the country into war with not one but both of the leading military powers on the continent, who were joined by Spain, England, and Piedmont. How did France of the Revolution come to sustain the shock? She was saved in the first hour by the dubious conduct of Brunswick. But after that? After that she put in the field much more numerous armies than those of the coalitions combined. To do it she needed a power whose absolutism was far different from that of the ancient monarchy, a power which could proclaim from now on until the enemy has been chased from the soil of the Republic, every Frenchman is permanently required for service in the armies. 9. The era of cannon fodder. This decision of the Convention of August 23, 1793, was followed by measures giving effect to it. In 1794, 1,169,000 men figured on the French military registers. A new era in military history now opened, the era of cannon fodder. Not a single general of the Ancien regime would ever have dared expose his troops in serried columns to the enemy's fire. Follard, who had proposed it, had been unable to get a hearing. The extended order of battle saved lives but brought no clear-cut decision. Whereas the generals of the Revolution and the Empire spent without counting the cost, power could now draw for them on the whole French nation. And history was to record that these massacres were the start of the decline of the population and vitality of France. Jourdan's Law of 1798 gave formal shape to the system of requisitioning men. Service was obligatory for men of between 20 and 25 years of age, who formed the first 5 classes, numbering 1,000,000 men. The law decided how many of them should be taken, and the conscripts were drawn by lot. Every year the oldest class could be recalled and a younger one called up. Napoleon was to employ this system. At first he took 80,000 men in each class, but, when he was making ready for the Russian campaign, he called up 120,000 men of the 1810 class, and after the disasters there he called up 150,000 men of the 1814 class besides bringing back 300,000 men of the classes on which he had at first economized. In all, from September 1805 to November 1813 he took from France 2,100,000 men in addition to the soldiers of the Republic who had been kept with the colors. How could the rest of Europe ever have fought him if it had not had recourse to like measures? Many governments only consented with reluctance to measures which smacked of barbarism. But adopted they were, and Napoleon was crushed beneath the weight of numbers. The advantage at first derived by France from intensive exploitation of her human potential was lost as soon as her competitors took to imitating her. The numerical balance of forces suggested the likelihood of crushing the French in 1793 or 1794. The French levy en masse prevented it. But when once the same methods had been adopted by all, France gained nothing by this postponement of the fatal day. 10. Total war. Germany, however, learned nothing from this experience. Alone of the victorious powers who forced France to give up the system by means of which she had desolated Europe, Prussia retained an analogous but aggravated system, which prepared the way for the victories of 1870. Their success frightened Europe so much that every continental country followed Germany's example and introduced military conscription. The splendid result of this was that in 1888 Europe's armies on a peace footing were the same in numbers as at the height of the Napoleonic Wars, 3 million men. The public expenditures of the European states, which came to £170 million in 1816, reached £868 million in 1898. In every country military expenditure took the lion's share. At length the storm broke, with results which we know. The dead numbered 8 million, the mutilated 6 million. Taking the belligerent countries as a whole, percent of the male labor force was destroyed. In France and Germany the figure was percent. And what was gained by so much destruction? The issue of the war would have been the same even if the armies engaged had been no larger than the professional armies of the 17th century. Just as revolutionary France, notwithstanding her intensive utilization of the national resources, finally succumbed to a coalition which could bring to bear a far superior human and economic potential, so it was with the Germany of William II. Her resistance broke down against such a combination of national forces as made it certain that, sooner or later, the balance of resources would be tilted against her. Thus it was demonstrated a second time that the advantage in the political race given by the growth of a state's requisitions on its people is but an ephemeral one, rivals are thereby incited to take like measures, and the growth results merely in hateful burdens in time of peace and in a frightful aggravation of the hecatombs and ruins of war. Had there to be a third demonstration? Our hearts fail us at the very thought of reckoning the price in human lives and cultural heritages destroyed. It was the blockade of Germany in the First World War that gave birth to the doctrine of total war. For the German state, as for its individual citizens, the satisfaction of needs is limited not only by the disposable funds available but also by the physical products of the limited areas controlled by the German armies. The measures necessitated by this situation become progressively systematized. In time of war all production must be planned by the state so as to get thereby the maximum war potential which is compatible with the need to maintain a minimum standard of life for the population. Thus the whole nation becomes a weapon of war wielded by the state, and the proportion engaged on warlike tasks is limited only by the need to keep it alive. This total identification of the nation with the armed forces seems only to have been envisaged towards the end of the First World War. Progress in this direction was at first tentative, and the doctrine finally emerged from policies which kept, even to the end, an uncoordinated and empirical air. The idea was nourished round the hearth of German nationalism, which bequeathed it to the National Socialist movement. Once in power, that movement embarked on such a reconstruction of the German economy as made it come to look like a man of war. Its purpose was battle, with every man of the crew at his station, either as combatant or as victualler of the combatants. The magazines were filled with shells, but the victualling of the crew had not been neglected on that account. Up to then the state, in the event of war, had requisitioned from the life of the nation only so much of its strength as was needed to sustain its warlike undertaking. But now, in time of peace, the state made ready the total utilization of the national resources for war. The first encounters in the Second World War had exactly the issue that could be expected in a fight between a cruiser and Atlantic liners which were equipped with guns but on board which stewards were still serving sluggish passengers. The outcome was different when Germany attacked a country, to wit Russia, in which, for 20 years, men had had their tasks assigned to them by the public authority. Political rivalry had its usual consequences, and England and the United States had soon to copy the German methods of war. These are the two countries in which the private person has been most successful in maintaining his rights against the state. The United States had not instituted military conscription until the time of the Civil War and had abolished it when once the danger was past. Even in the First World War England had created a national army only after long hesitation, and the right of the state to constrain the subject was regarded as so questionable that the refusal of conscientious objectors to serve was admitted. Under stress of need, power had, it is true, swallowed up the nation's substance by borrowing and inflation, but it had afterwards taken on itself to restore what it had so taken by putting back the currency, pounds or dollars, to its old parity. In time of war, no other means than those derived from its extraordinary credits had been employed by the state to divert production to its requirements. It may be observed, however, that in the years immediately preceding the Second World War the state had made some notable addition to its empire, especially in the United States. The struggle against Germany witnessed its triumph. For the first time in history, a president of the United States looked on the mass of his fellow citizens as human potential, to be used as might best serve the prosecution of the war. Thus we see how, ever since the Middle Ages, to keep their places in the political race, states have been increasing the sacrifices which they demand of their nations. Whereas the Capetian kings made war with a few seigneurial contingents whose service was for no more than 40 days, the popular states of today have power to call to the colors, and keep there indefinitely, the entire male population. Whereas the feudal monarchs could nourish hostilities only with the resources of their own domains, their successors have at their disposal the entire national income. The citizens of medieval cities at war could, if they were not too near to the actual theater of operations, take no notice of it. Nowadays friend and foe alike would burn their houses, slaughter their families, and measure their own doughty deeds in ravaged acres. Even thought herself, in former times contemptuous of these brawls, has now been roped in by devotees of conquest to proclaim the civilizing virtues of gangsters and incendiaries. How is it possible not to see in this stupendous degradation of our civilization the fruits of state absolutism? Everything is thrown into war because power disposes of everything. Industrial rivalry would go the same way as political, if masters exercised unlimited rule over their men. However humane they might be by nature, they would be forced to exact ever greater efforts from the subject mass below them, under the vital spur of keeping abreast of a rival's efforts. This hateful consequence of rivalry is checked only because trade union opposition sets a limit to what the masters can exact. Why does the modern state meet no organized resistance? The Ancien regime met with such resistance, which was offered it by the representatives of the various elements in the nation who fought in line against power. But in the modern regime these elements have become power, and the people are left in consequence without a champion. Those who are the state reserve to themselves alone the right to talk in the name of the nation, and interest of the nation as distinct from the interest of the state has no existence for them. They would crush as sedition what the monarchy would have received as remonstrance. Under the pretext that power has been given to the nation, and from refusal to see that there are here two bodies which are and must ever be distinct, the nation has been delivered over to power.